Chapter 2. Heather suspects something. Next day, the sheep woke up to a new world, a world without any shepherd or any sheepdog. They hesitated for a long time before deciding to leave the barn. At last, they ventured out into the open air, led by Marple the whale, who was hungry. It was a beautiful morning. Fairies had danced on the grass overnight and left thousands of dewdrops behind. The sea looked as if it had been licked clean, blue and clear and smooth, and there were a few woolly little clouds in the sky. Legend said that these clouds were sheep who had simply wandered over the cliff tops one day, special sheep who now went on grazing in the sky and were never shorn. In any case, they were a good sign. A mood of tremendous high spirits came over the sheep. They had spent a long time standing around yesterday, their sinews aching with tension. Today, they gamboled over the meadow like March lambs, galloping towards the steep cliffs, stopping just before the land dropped away, and then racing back to the hay barn. Soon they were all out of breath. That was when Marple the whale had the idea of the vegetable garden. Behind the hay barn stood the shepherd's caravan, a rickety vehicle in which George Glenn once used to go around the countryside with another flock of sheep. Recently, he just kept a few odds and ends in it. Behind the caravan, George had laid out a little vegetable garden, growing lettuces, peas, radishes, cress, tomatoes, endives, buttercups, and a few chives. He had fenced it in. The vegetable garden was in the meadow, but the sheep weren't allowed into it. This ban was hard on them, especially as the fence in itself presented no real problem. But George's watchfulness had kept them from harvesting the produce of this vegetable paradise in their own sheepy way. Now George was gone. Lane pushed back the bolt with her muzzle. Maud started grazing the buttercups. Cloud set to work on the peas, and Heather on the tomatoes. After a few minutes, there was nothing left of the neatly planted beds. Gradually, all fell silent. The sheep looked at each other, feeling ashamed. One by one, they trotted back to the meadow. Othello, the only one who hadn't taken part in the raid, was standing by the gate. He signaled to Miss Marple, who followed him to the back of the caravan, where the spade that George used for working in the vegetable garden usually leaned. Today, however, there was nothing to be seen but the whitewashed side of the caravan and a few flies basking in the sun. Othello looked inquiringly at Miss Marple. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully back. The sheep spent the rest of the morning feeling remorseful. Marple had eaten so many slugs along with the lettuce that he didn't feel well. One of the lambs had a sharp piece of wood stuck in one hoof and was limping. They thought about George. "He'd have been very cross," said Richfield. "He could have made that hoof better," said Cloud. "He used to read us stories," said Cordelia. That was true. George had spent a lot of time in the meadow. He would turn up early in the morning when they were still deep in their sheepy slumber, huddled close together. Tess, herself still drowsy at that hour, had to drive them apart. George would laugh. "You lazy creatures," he would say. "Come on, get down to work." They felt slightly injured every morning. They grazed while George worked in the vegetable garden or did a few repairs. Their sense of injury would wear off by the afternoon. Then they gathered in front of the steps of the caravan, and George read to them, sometimes from a fairy tale, which told them how dew falls on the meadows, sometimes from a book about the diseases of sheep, which scared them, once from a detective story, which they didn't understand. George probably didn't understand it either, because he threw the book away when he was halfway through it, and they never did find out who the murderer was. But mostly, old George Glenn read love stories, slim volumes printed on grayish paper in which the heroines were all called Pamela and had red hair like a sunset in the South Seas. George didn't read these stories because he was the romantic sort, or because he had poor literary taste, which he certainly did. The book about the diseases of sheep had tried their patience sorely. He read to he read to them to let off steam. He read how the red-headed Pamelas lured innocent pirates, doctors, or barons into their clutches. And he got very worked up, saying bad things about all the red-headed women in the world, particularly his own wife. When George revealed details of his home life, the sheep listened in astonishment. She had been the most beautiful woman in the village, his own personal Pamela, and at first he could hardly believe his luck. But as soon as they were married, Pamela, whose real name was Kate, started baking juicy apple pies and got fat. George stayed thin, and his manner became increasingly dry. He had dreamed of traveling all over Europe with a flock of sheep, and apple pie was no substitute. At this point, the sheep usually bowed their heads. They would have loved to travel to Europe, which they pictured as a huge meadow full of apple trees. Now we'll never go to Europe, said Zora. We'll never even go to the other pasture again, said Heather. Today would have been the day for our tablets. Only Lane was sorry George wasn't here to force their weekly calcium tablets in their mouth. She loved the taste. The other sheep shuddered. Marple felt emotional. We shouldn't forget him. No, we shouldn't forget him, he said. And we shouldn't have eaten those vegetables. Why not? Zora said casually, staring in the direction of the sea. Marple chewed his last lettuce leaf vigorously. When Zora said something that sounded casual, he was always struck as if by lightning. How are you going to put it right? Asked Cloud. They decided to devote a small section of their meadow to George's memory. Not in the vegetable garden, which was past praying for anyway. At the foot of the hill, however, they found a patch where many of their favorite herbs grew, and they decided that no sheep was to graze there anymore. They called it George's Place. Suddenly, they felt relieved. Miss Maple watched from a distance as her flock founded George's Place. She thought of George reading them stories. It also occurred to her that he had turned up less and less frequently over the last few weeks. Often he hadn't come to the meadow to see them at all, but just drove quickly past in his stinking car. Tess would jump off the passenger seat and shoo them into action in the morning, and she and George came back in the evening to count them. But they were away all day long. At first, George had tried to teach Tessie to herd them when he wasn't there, but the sheepdog was convinced that her main job was to herd George. She herded the sheep only as a favor to him. Miss Maple thought about Tess. Had she run away? If so, then it must have been something very terrible that had killed George. The dog was as faithful as a mother ewe. She would have done anything for George, but George was dead, and now Tess had disappeared. Moving with unusual rapidity, Marple broke away from the group admiring George's place and began to feel hungry for the very herbs that grew there. He trotted towards Miss Maple, but Sir Richfield suddenly barred his way. Miss Maple couldn't tell where he had come from all of a sudden. Richfield looked menacingly at the younger ram, and Marple trotted away again, not back to George's place, but over to the cliffs, where he could gaze thoughtfully down at the beach. Sometimes you have to make the young'uns respect you, Richfield said, or they'll end up like Melmoth. Miss Maple did not reply to this. No sheep could have been less like Melmoth than Marple. Gradually, the enthusiasm for George's place died down. The sheep set about their usual occupation of grazing, while Miss Maple looked on. It was a good thing they had calmed down. When they were full of grass and less excited, they'd regain their curiosity about the murderer. They would take comfort breaks for eating, but they wouldn't let up on the job. Maple knew them all. She had seen the younger sheep grow up. She herself had grown up with the older sheep. When she was still a lamb, the escapades of Richfield and his twin Melmoth had kept the flock all agog. It was so long since Richfield last mentioned him that Maple had thought he'd forgotten him. Now she felt uneasy. The air was perfect. A cool wind blew off the sea. The meadow was fragrant. All the same, the whole place suddenly smelled of death. New death and old, almost forgotten death. Maple began to graze. The flock had human visitors again that afternoon. A plump woman and a black-clad man with a stiff collar round his neck and a strikingly long nose came up from the village. The woman wore black too, but with her fiery red hair, blue eyes, and rosy cheeks, she looked colorful to the sheep. She smelled of apples. Such a nice smell that this time there were 5 observers listening in on the 2 of them at the same time. Miss Maple, Othello, Heather, a young sheep called Maisie, and Marple the whale. When the humans came to the dolmen, they stopped. "Was it here?" asked the woman. The man nodded. The brightly colored woman stared at the ground. The rain had washed away the mark where the spade went in, so she was staring at the wrong spot. "It's so terrible," she said in a thread of a voice. "Who'd do a thing like that? I mean, who'd do it?" The sheep pricked up their ears. Perhaps the tall man in black was going to provide the answer, but he said nothing. "I didn't always have an easy time with him," added the woman. "No one had an easy time with George," said the long-nosed man. "He was a lost soul, a lamb gone astray, but the Lord in his infinite mercy has taken him home again." The sheep looked at each other in surprise. Cloud bleated. "I wish I'd known him better," the woman went on. "He was so strange recently. I thought it was old age coming on. He went out in the car so much. He had letters that I wasn't allowed to open, and," she said, stretching up a little way to whisper in the tall man's ear. But the sheep heard her all the same. "And I found out that he was reading novels in secret. Love stories they were." She went red. It suited her. The man looked at her with interest. "Really?" he asked. They moved slowly towards the shepherd's caravan. The sheep felt nervous. Any moment now the damage they'd done to George's vegetable garden would be revealed. The woman's eyes wandered over the caravan. The vegetable beds stripped bare, the tomato plants pulled up. "It's so beautiful here," she sighed. The sheep couldn't believe their ears. "Perhaps I ought to have come up to see him here sometimes, but he didn't want me to. He never let me. I could have brought him apple pie. Too late for that now." She had tears in her eyes. "I never took any interest in the animals. George brought the wool home, and then I took over. Lovely, soft wool," she sobbed. What will happen to the flock now, Kate?" asked the long-nosed man. "This is a fine piece of grazing land, so it is, and someone must care for the sheep." Kate glanced round. "They don't seem to need anyone to care for them. They look perfectly happy to me." The man's voice was tart. "A flock needs a shepherd. I dare say Ham would buy them if you don't want to be troubled with them." The sheep froze with horror, but the woman shrugged her shoulders. "Ham's no shepherd," she said. "He wouldn't care for them." "There are different ways of caring for someone, with love and with rigor, with the word and with the sword. So the Lord has told us. Order, that's what matters." The black-clad man's big nose was pointing at the woman's face in a reproachful way. "If you feel awkward about approaching Ham yourself, I can do it for you," he added. The woman shook her head, and the sheep sighed with relief. No, all that business with Ham was over and done with long ago. But I don't even know if everything belongs to me anyway. There's a will. George left it with a lawyer in town. It must be a very unusual will, because he looked around for ages before he found the right lawyer. The will is sure to say who gets everything. I don't want it. I just hope he hasn't left anything to her. Suddenly, she didn't seem to think the meadow was so beautiful anymore. Let's go. The man nodded. Be brave, my child. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. And they marched off right across George's place, crushing several fresh shoots underfoot. Othello ground his teeth. I wouldn't want that lord of his to be my shepherd. The others nodded. I shall run away before they sell us to the butcher, bleated Marple. I shall jump off the cliff, said Zora. The others knew that secretly Zora hoped to end up as one of those very special cloud sheep. You'll all stay here, said Miss Maple gently. At least we found out what a last will and testament is. It says who George's things and his sheep belong to now. Yes, and it's been left in a laurel in town, added Heather. And it will tell that long-nosed man that George would never have sold us to the butcher. They were feeling very relieved. I hope they find it soon, said Lane. George was not a lamb, said Heather. That woman was too old to be his child, said Marple. The tall man was lying, said Othello. He didn't like George, not one little bit. And I don't like him. I don't like the sound of that other man either. The Lord he was talking about. It was that Lord who did it, cried Heather suddenly. He took George home with him, and then it happened. They quarreled, first with words, and then with the sword. Only there wasn't any sword handy, so he used the spade. Marple agreed with her. They were probably quarreling about order. George never kept things in very good order, except his vegetable garden. He looked in the direction of George's place, rather ashamed of himself. The next thing we must do is find out who that lord is. Maple looked at him skeptically. Cloud had said nothing so far, but now she perked up. The Lord is a lamb. The others stared at her in astonishment. Even Cloud herself looked surprised. No, the Lord is a shepherd, Heather contradicted her. A very bad shepherd, much worse than George. Cloud shook her head. No, it wasn't like that. If I could only remember better. Cloud stared at a tuft of grass in front of her hooves, but the sheep could tell that she was thinking of something quite different. That man, I know him. He came to our meadow once before, long ago. I was still a lamb. George had me in his arms. He'd just been trimming my hooves. Everything smelled of earth and sun, like a summer shower. Such a lovely smell. And then something bitter. I could smell at once that George didn't like the man. The man was inviting George to something, but his voice was unfriendly. He said he wanted to give a blessing to the dumb animals. I didn't know what a blessing meant, but it sounded uncomfortable. I thought he meant me because George had said I was a Dumbo just before because I couldn't keep still. I was scared. George laughed. If you mean Ham, you give him your blessing every Sunday, he said. The other man got very angry. I don't remember what he said, but he talked about the Lord a lot and how he was going to divide the sheep from the goats. The sheep bleated in alarm. Cloud stared thoughtfully at her tuft of grass. Only when Zora nuzzled her side gently did she go on. After a bit, George got angry. He dumped me in the long-nosed man's arms. Give this dumb animal a blessing, then, he said. The other man smelled bad, and I was scared. He didn't know how to hold me properly, but he took me away with him. His house was the biggest one in the village, tall and pointy and cold, like the man himself. He shut me into his garden, all alone. There was an apple tree, but he'd put a fence round it, and the apples were just rotting on the ground. Several of the sheep bleated indignantly. Cloud shuddered. Then a whole lot of humans came streaming into the house all at once. They brought dogs with them, and other sheep, and a pig. And I had to go in too. There was a terrible racket, but the man in black talked above it. Welcome to the house of God, he said. She stopped and looked thoughtful. So, his name is God, said Sir Richfield. Othello made a strange face. God? Could be, said Cloud uncertainly. But after a while, I worked out that they were worshiping a special lamb. I thought that was a nice idea. They called it the Lord. There was music, like on the radio, only not quite the same. I looked round a bit and got a nasty fright. There was a man hanging on the wall with no clothes on, and even though he was bleeding from lots of wounds, you couldn't smell the blood. She wouldn't say any more. And there was a spade sticking into him, right? Asked Sir Richfield triumphantly. This God sounds rather suspicious to me, said Marple. He's very powerful, Cloud went on. All the people went down on their knees in front of him, and he said he knows everything. Maud thoughtfully chewed some grass. I remember that time, she said. Cloud was away for a whole day. Her mother was looking for her like a mother would. Why didn't you ever tell us about this before? Asked Zora. I didn't understand it, said Cloud quietly. She looked a little dreamy and began awkwardly rubbing her nose on one of her forelegs. The sheep thought some more about God. He can't know everything, bleated Othello. He didn't know that George reads those Pamela novels. Used to read them, said Sir Richfield dryly. The murderer always returns to the scene of the crime, said Marple the wit. And the long-nosed man did return to the scene of the crime. Marple looked round proudly. That was the one useful fact that they had learned from George's detective story. Marple, of course, had remembered it. What do you think? He asked Miss Maple. It does seem suspicious, she nodded. He didn't like George, and George didn't like him. He seems too interested in what's going to happen to us and the meadow. And when they were standing in front of the doorman, he looked at the exact spot, just where George was lying. Impressed, the sheep said nothing. Maple went on. But it could be just a coincidence. He was looking at the ground the whole time. There are too many questions. What was the business with Ham that was over and done with long ago? Who is she, the person that Kate hoped George hasn't left anything to? It isn't easy to understand humans, said Maud. The sheep lowered their heads. They grazed a little, and they thought. Marple was thinking that he hadn't always understood even George, although George was quite easy to understand for a human. He was interested in his vegetable garden, and he read Pamela stories to his sheep. He wasn't interested in apple pie. But recently, George had been doing some odd things. Every now and then, he got out the target. When George marched across the meadow in his gumboots with the round, brightly painted target, Marple felt an urge to find a safe place. The only safe place where you couldn't see the target was behind the shepherd's caravan, close to the vegetable garden. When George came out of the caravan for the second time with his gleaming pistol, he would find Marple there. Then he aimed it at Marple and shouted, "Caught you in the act! Hands up!" Marple always ran for it, scuttling zigzag across the meadow, and George laughed. The noise had always been unbearable, but once George had bought a silencer, all you heard was a soft smacking sound, like a sheep biting into an apple. This sound, together with Marple's fear, was the only perceptible outcome of George's enthusiasm for firing his pistol. There was no point in it. Marple would have been delighted to produce the same sound with real apples, but George wasn't giving up his target practice. Miss Maple was thinking of the way Lily's hands had wandered over George's jacket, like insects trying to find something. Zora was thinking how bad humans were about heights. As soon as they had tottered too close to the cliffs, they turned pale, and their movements became even clumsier. On the cliff tops, a sheep was infinitely superior to any human. Even George could do nothing about it when Zora jumped down onto her favorite rocky ledge. He stayed a safe distance away. He knew that it was a waste of time trying to lure her back with blandishments, so he would call and begin throwing things at her. First, dirty tufts of grass, then dried sheep droppings. From the depths below, the wind sometimes carried back to him the sound of a thin, long drawn-out curse. George's temper instantly improved. He would get down on all fours, crawl to the edge of the cliffs, and look to see tourists or villagers who had been hit on the head by his missiles. Zora saw them too, of course. Then they would look at each other, the shepherd lying on his front grinning, and Zora enthroned on her ledge like a mountain goat. At that moment, they understood one another perfectly. Zora thought that human beings would be a lot better off if they could only make up their minds to go around on four legs. Ramses was thinking of the story of the escaped tiger that Othello sometimes told to a marveling flock of lambs. Heather was thinking of the road they took to the other pasture, of the humming of insects, the noise of cars and their stinking fumes as they drove past the sheep, of the shining surface of the sea. In spring, the air smelled of damp earth. In summer, flocks of sparrows fluttered like leaves through the cornfields. In autumn, when the wind shook the trees, acorns pattered down on the sheep. In winter, the hoarfrost drew strange patterns on the asphalt. It was always a wonderful way to go until they came to the place where the green men lay in wait. The green men had caps and guns and meant no good. When they came to the green men, even George felt nervous. All the same, he gave them a friendly greeting and made sure their dogs didn't get too close to the sheep. Without George, they'd never have made it past the men. Heather wondered if they would ever see the other pasture again. Cordelia was thinking how human beings can invent words, how they can line up their invented words side by side on paper. It was magic. And even that Cordelia knew only because George had explained what magic is. When George read aloud and came to a word that he thought the sheep couldn't understand, he explained it. Sometimes he explained words sheep knew anyway, words like prophylactics and antibiotics. You took prophylactics before you got ill. You took antibiotics while you were ill. They both tasted bitter. George didn't seem to know his way around the subject too well. He got involved in a complicated explanation. Finally, he swore and gave it up. But he was very pleased with other explanations, even if the sheep didn't understand a word he said. In such cases, they were careful not to let George guess how little they had taken in. Sometimes, however, he really did teach them something new. Cordelia loved his explanations. She loved knowing words that belonged to things she'd never seen, even to things you couldn't see at all. She remembered those words carefully. Magic, George had said, is something unnatural, something that doesn't really exist. If I snap my fingers and Othello suddenly turns white, that's magic. If I fetch a bucket of paint and paint him white, it isn't. He laughed, and for a moment it looked as if he felt like snapping his fingers or fetching that bucket. Then he went on. Everything that looks like magic is really a trick. There's no such thing as magic. Cordelia grazed with relish. Magic was her favorite word for something that didn't exist at all. Then she thought about George's death. That was like magic, too. Someone had stuck a spade through the shepherd's body in the middle of their meadow. George must have screamed horribly, but none of his sheep in the hay barn, quite close, had heard anything. And then a lamb had seen a ghost silently dancing. Cordelia shook her head. It's really a trick, she whispered. Othello was thinking of the cruel clown. Lane was thinking of the strange humans who used to visit George from time to time. They always came by night. Lane slept lightly and heard the crunch of car tires when they turned off the paved road and onto the path through the fields. She sometimes hid in the shadow of the dolmen to watch. It was a show performed just for her. The headlights of the cars cut lines of light through the darkness, or were caught in the mist and formed a glowing white cloud. The cars that came along the path through the fields were big with purring engines, and they didn't stink nearly as bad as George's car, which he himself called the Antichrist. Then their lights were switched off, and one or two shadowy figures in long dark coats would approach the shepherd's caravan. They moved cautiously, taking care not to tread on any fresh sheep droppings in the dark. A hand knocked on the wooden door, once, twice, 3 times. The door of the caravan was opened, cutting a rectangular space filled with a reddish glow in the darkness. For a moment, the strangers stood in the doorway like huge, sharply outlined ravens. Lane had never seen their faces, yet by now they seemed to her almost familiar. Something dark was moving along the path over the fields towards the meadow. It moved fast. There was a moment of panic among the sheep, who all galloped uphill without taking their eyes off the newcomer. God was back. He was pacing up and down the meadow like a hound on a trail, his long nose pointing to the ground. He walked all around the dolmen and up the footpath to the cliffs. He almost fell over the edge, but at the last moment that nose shot up again and saw the great expanse of blue in front of it. Then the tall black body came to a halt. A sigh passed through the flock. The sheep had been watching God and the movements of his nose ever since the pair of them had started towards the cliff. The black-clad man glanced briefly their way. Othello lowered his horns menacingly, but God had already set off along the path towards the village. After 3 or 4 paces, he heard something. He froze, then turned abruptly and fled along the footpath out to the moorland, his face pale and anxious. The sheep heard it too, a humming, rushing noise. It sounded like the noise they themselves had made when they invaded George's vegetable garden. It was coming closer. Now they heard dogs barking, and there were human voices too. The sheep saw exactly what the long-nosed man had been running away from. A flock was moving towards the meadow, a flock such as a sheep had never seen before.